Francisco, it's a pleasure to be with you here at this conference, the Quest for Consonance, Theology and the Natural Sciences. You've been dealing with this question of consonance, and the issue is, I guess, at its most fundamental level, is that the fundamental of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions is that God created the world and God created humans, but evolution, we know, created humans. So that's where those look like they're in conflict. So how do you get consonance out of that?
I see evolution, science in general, and religion as two windows to look at the world. They're different windows that see the world in different ways. It's the same world, but what you see is different. So what evolution tells us is how life originated on Earth. We don't know much about that particular issue, but we understand it has to have happened by natural process. And then we know very much about what happened over the last several million years in terms of gradual evolution and the eventual origin of our own species. So evolution tells us those are natural processes. Now, God tells us that we are creatures of God. Well, just at this conference yesterday, one of the theologians was saying, well, but evolution cannot explain everything. God has to intervene at some point. Otherwise, how are we going to call the world created by God? And I used the following analogy. Assume I'm a person of faith, and I believe, therefore, that I have been personally created by God. I can accept that, and still I don't have to believe that God intervened in my process of development. I can accept that I was conceived in the womb of my mother and that I was developed there for some months and eventually was born and grew up and went to school and did several things. I can have this natural explanation of my life and at the same time believe that I am a creature of God. See, again, two different ways of looking at the world.
Many people, particularly on the theology side, theologians, like to draw this parallelism. And many sophisticated people make the argument that you've just made. But implicit in that sounds like there's a symmetry, two different ways of looking at the world, and they have, as we would say, they're epistemically equal. They have the same claim to knowledge. Now, if I put my scientist hat on, and I left biology, but I did a doctorate in neuroscience, so I'm somewhat familiar with biology. I would say that symmetry is false. That science has a third-party verification. You can be in India or Vietnam or the U.S. If you're a scientist, you will agree with the same kinds of conclusions pretty much after a period of time. And that's not at all the case with theology. Theology is very chaotic. Everybody has different opinions, and there's no independent verification that has any reliability. So isn't there this false dichotomy that putting the two together in this parallelism belies the fact that science is a much more accurate determination of what the world looks like?
Well, it's, again, two different ways of looking at the world. The way they look at the world is different. Epistemically, to use the term that you mentioned earlier, they are very different. Because in science, we formulate hypotheses, explanations, and then we can test them by observation and experiment and reject them if they are not correct, right, or accept them and go the next step and the next step and the next step. Theology does not have that ability of testing its hypothesis. Religion is a question of faith. So you accept a way of looking at the world, and that's it. You can not easily convince people who have a different religious view of your own views,
right,
because
right,
there is no way of testing one against the other,
right,
saying this is correct, this is not.
Right.
You can look at religion to see with a particular way of looking theologically at the world is helpful, more helpful than others. So religions that promote, say, massive killings of people who believe otherwise is not a religion that I want to have anything to do with. Yeah. But nevertheless, there are people who accept those religions. But in a way, there's a manner of testing the validity of religion, what consequences it has for the world. And I am bringing up this particular issue of terrorism, for example, that some religious views seem to stimulate, saying, well, that's not something that I want to have anything to do with. I think the religious view has to be necessarily wrong. It contradicts what we think about human nature, about society, about the world.
You have truly a unique background as one of the world's great biologists, evolutionists, geneticists. At the same time, your early background was as a Dominican priest, and in the Dominican order, a very sophisticated part of the Catholic tradition. Can you reflect in terms of your own deep emergence, both as so few people in the world are so deeply immersed on both sides of this controversial issue? Can you speak in terms of your own understandings based on such deep-rooted, sophisticated understandings?
I studied theology for 5 years, and I have an advanced degree in theology, as I have an advanced degree in science. During the years that I was studying theology, and then ever since in a way, I have been reflecting about these issues, how to look at the world. And of course, the theology that I was studying was primarily Christian theology, the Christian tradition. And the issues that from the beginning came up to my mind and bothered me were precisely the way in which the creation of the world was explained, particularly those who took the Bible literally and the 6 days of creation. And the problems started, in my case, from the very beginning, because if you know much about the Bible and you have read the Bible, you know that chapter Genesis, the first book of the Bible, chapter 1 tells us how God created the world. And eventually on the 6th day, God creates men and women, creates them at the same time. Then you go into chapter 2, and verse 4 starts, this is how God created the world. And it's a completely different narrative. It starts creating the male only. Yeah. And then creates the rest of the world. And after having created the plants and the animals, and so God realizes, there's the implication of the Bible, that this person, this man is missing something, puts him to sleep, takes a rib, and out of the rib make a woman, and there's Eve, you have now Adam and Eve. Well, those two narratives, chapter 1 and chapter 2, cannot be literally correct. And there are actually 6 more narratives of the creation of the world in the Bible, mostly in what we call in the Old Testament. So that you have to take into account from the very beginning that the religious views themselves didn't seem to be compatible one with another. And that's one of the things that moved me towards the scientific explanations.